The Muggle Death Eater and His Daughter by Great 78. Chapter 15. Assemblies in Alcoves. The next evening, a Friday in late September, 1995. The first month of Hermione's 5th year had been rather uninspiring. The start of school was usually filled with excitement, even that first year when she had hardly known anyone. At least then she'd had new and different school subjects to look forward to learning. This year, so far, had had none of the excitement of the Triwizard Tournament, or the danger of Dementors. There was no mystery of strange voices and sinister messages in the corridors, no Death Day party, no midnight duels, no contraband dragons. In fact, it had hardly any excitement at all. Every bit of fun at Hogwarts was being sucked dry by the new Defense Against the Dark Arts professor. Dolores Jane Umbridge had been ensconced at Hogwarts in part because the school had difficulty attracting talent for that subject. There were many that felt the position was cursed. And in part because lately Dumbledore had taken to telling anyone who would listen that Voldemort had returned. One person who was listening very carefully to what Dumbledore had to say was Harry Potter. Late in the night he came downstairs into the common room to talk to Hermione, occasionally bringing Ron with him. The three of them discussed all manner of things, from Umbridge's failings as a teacher to the dreams Harry often suffered. The dreams often featured Voldemort, and to Harry they felt premonitory and dangerous. Harry had spent his last days of summer at the house of his godfather, Sirius Black. There he, along with Black and Lupin, had spent hours following the clues about Voldemort's and Peter's whereabouts. It had become an obsession for the three of them. Unfortunately, much of Harry's information was second-hand through Sirius and Remus. For whatever reason, Dumbledore was ignoring him, which really messed with Harry's head. Yes, he had lost the Triwizard Tournament, but did that mean that he was useless? Dumbledore seemed to think so, at least according to Harry. This seemed odd to Hermione. She would have thought, seeing as Harry had actually faced Voldemort, not just as a baby but in his first and second years at school, that he would be one of the first to be read into the situation, if the situation were actually true. The Ministry was not interested in such nonsensical rumours. No, it much preferred to stick its head in the proverbial sand, and ignore the very idea. And so it laid an ostrich egg, dressed in a tacky pink cardigan, and wearing a ridiculous black bow in her hair. Dolores Umbridge seemed especially capable of getting under her students' skin. Her idea of Defense Against the Dark Arts was theoretical at best, and barely scratched the surface at that. By the time most students had read a few pages of each chapter, their brains had turned into a mushy mess of jargon and theory, resulting in a hodgepodge of impractical knowledge with no useful application in the real world. "We aren't learning anything in Defense Against the Dark Arts," Hermione complained to Draco and Pansy one evening in the library. The three of them were working on a group project for ancient runes. So far, Hermione had done about 70% of the work, whilst Draco had done 50%. Of their overlapping 20%, Pansy deemed Hermione's better, and Draco's was discarded. As for Pansy, she was finishing up the second coat on her fingernail polish. "Who cares? That's one less class we have to study for, then," Pansy said. "And it isn't like it matters that much. After all, when dark magic is used, we're going to have to rely on instinct, not necessarily book knowledge." Draco spoke over her. Hermione huffed. Draco knew that the idea of not relying on book knowledge was preposterous to the bookish Gryffindor. Pansy shifted her eyes sideways at Draco. "Right, yes." Draco knew that some of his fellow Slytherins had heard the whispers of the Dark Lord's imminent return, and whilst they may or may not be looking forward to it, They were treating it as an inevitability. Crabbe, Goyle, and Pusey planned to join up as soon as possible with the Dark Lord's army. Theo was already considering escaping to Ibiza this summer. Blaise was going to stay with his father's family in Italy if war broke out. Daphne and her sister Astoria were leaving for America with Miles and Margaret Bletchley. And as for Pansy, her plan was to simply sit back and let everyone else fight over it. Like a cat with 9 lives, she would land on her feet, whoever was in power. And Draco? The truth was, he had no idea. He knew where Hermione's heart lay. Regardless of what Lucius believed, she wasn't an agent of the Dark Lord. That much was clear. Had she wanted to kill Potter, she'd had ample opportunities over the years. But if Hermione were presented as a pureblood, and they could get married after school was finished, would it be so awful having to live under Voldemort's thumb? They could go away to France, perhaps stay there. Draco had enough money to make that happen. If there was a second Wizarding War, it wouldn't need to affect them. But on days like this, he could see the fire in her copper eyes. He could feel the intensity of her courage coming through her words. It made his stomach churn, and his heart race, and his blood run cold with thrill and fear. Because if she followed the path of Potter and Dumbledore, and all the while he was duty-bound to follow the ways of the Malfoys before him, what would that mean for the 2 of them? Walking Hermione back to the Gryffindor common room, Draco asked, "What's your plan? With Umbridge?" "What do you mean?" Hermione, feigning innocence. "Come off it, witch. I've known you too long. I know that big brain is working on some kind of solution to that problem you mentioned." Hermione raised an eyebrow at him. "Well, shows what you know." Her steps faltered as the truth emerged. "I really don't have a good solution. I mean, what can a bunch of underage wizards do against a professor? And a ministry official at that? I mean, she has all the power here." There were a handful of Gryffindors returning from dinner, further up the corridor. Draco pulled her into a nearby alcove for privacy, dropping their book bags and leaning against the wall. He pulled her into his arms, linking his fingers behind the small of her back. Pressed against him, her body felt so warm and alive. "Hermione, if there's one thing I've learned about you, it's that if you want the power, you can take it, any time," he murmured. He smiled lazily at her, looking at the adorable Cupid's bow of her pink lips. They looked so soft, so kissable. Her lovely copper eyes, framed in thick lashes, blinked slowly at him, mesmerized as he moved closer. Their lips met, and Hermione sighed at the contact. Draco's hands flattened against her back, kneading her waist gently. He pulled her closer, closer to him, until she was standing between his legs. Her long hair, falling down her back, tickled against his hands as he held her. The softness and warmth of her skin through her blouse felt like molten silk beneath his fingers. Hermione ran her hands up and down the hard muscles of his arms as they held her. She tipped her head back, and he kissed her neck, nibbling small love bites, and then soothing them lovingly with his warm tongue. Tentatively, Draco's hands ran down the outer curve of the sides of her breasts, and Hermione's response was so enthusiastic that Draco had to shush her with another deep kiss. She broke away a bit and leaned against a wall, and pulled him into her. He tried to curl his body in a way that she might not notice what was happening below his belt. How incredibly mortifying, he thought. but her hands travelled from his shoulders lower, lower, to his hips. She squeezed gently, then pulled him against her. The feel of his length against her stomach was unmistakable and undeniable. His embarrassment flushed on his face as he whispered softly, urgently into her ear, "I'm sorry. I can't help it. You're so... you." His forehead fell to hers, and he closed his eyes at the awkwardness of it. "Don't be sorry. I'm glad you can't help it," she whispered back. "I can't help it either." He looked up then, catching sight of the sparkle in her copper eyes. He surged forward to kiss her again with a growl, his hands buried in the tumultuous hair at the nape of her neck. "Mr. Malfoy, Miss Granger, when you're done inspecting that alcove for loitering students, please finish your prefect rounds and go to your respective common rooms." The low voice of Professor Snape drawled only feet away, on the other side of the tapestry from them. Hermione startled and nearly shrieked at the first words, but Draco managed to clamp a hand over her mouth just in time. She cut her eyes sideways at him. Her eyes widened, then narrowed. She nodded slightly, and he moved his hand. "Yes, Professor," Draco called smoothly, and there was a swish of fabric as the potion master moved off. "Oh, my goodness! Oh, my goodness! I can't believe it!" Hermione whisper-shouted. She wrung her hands, panicked. "Do you think we're going to be in trouble? Oh, my goodness! We're going to be in so much trouble!" "Hermione, calm down," he laughed quietly. "Snape catches Blaise and Daphne about 5 times a week, and Theo and whoever he's snogging this week even more than that. You won't get detention or docked house points, if that's what you're worried about." "You're sure?" She looked up pleadingly with her huge copper eyes, freckles along the bridge of her nose standing out in sharp relief from her suddenly pale skin. He smiled and kissed her on the forehead. She was so beautiful, so ardent and impassioned. He loved that. He loved her. He stood, stock still, falling slightly against the wall, eyes widening as he stared at her. He had not realized it before, but yes, he did love her. Oh, fuck. He'd had no idea. Hermione only looked at him quizzically as he stood there, leaned against the wall in the alcove. "Are you all right?" Yes." "Well, I'm going to go ahead so we aren't seen leaving at the same time." And with that, Hermione rushed to him, cupping his face in both hands and kissing him once more. He grabbed her as if to pick up where they left off at Snape's untimely arrival, but she pulled away. "Bye." He raised his hand in farewell, but she was already through the tapestry. He fell against the wall, his hand finding his forehead and rubbing. How had this happened? With everything else going on, with the looming fear of the Dark Lord's return and Professor Umbridge's moronic decrees, he'd fallen in love. Somehow, his feet carried him down the several flights of stairs to the dungeon without the need for his brain to engage. When he finally reached his dormitory, 10 minutes later, Blaise gestured to his bed. "Your parents' owl brought a note. He's a real asshole, you know." "Yeah, Colwyn's personality leaves a lot to be desired," Draco agreed. He picked up the note to read. D. He has returned. Richard and I met him at his ancestral home. Richard has a secret mission from him. I do not know what it is, but be cautious. It may involve Hermione. Stay alert, and stay out of her way. Assist her, if you are able. L-A-M. Draco read the note 3 times through, then leaned over the side of his bed and, to the surprise and disgust of his assembled roommates, vomited onto the floor. Soft organ music suffused the frankincense-scented air. The lighting was dim, purposefully. Clusters of dozens of candles were lit at intervals, set into red and white votive cups, giving the space an ethereal glow. The overall mood was mellow and reverent, but Richard was watchful. Despite his seemingly affable, mild-mannered demeanor, Richard could not enter a room without assessing threats, locating all exit points, checking the area for potential surveillance. He had been taught this in his time with the various military organizations he had served in, both those listed on the British Army rosters and those that were not. A person could very well turn off the intuition once he had moved into the private sector of dentistry. Now, however, after quickly and quietly analyzing, memorizing, and cataloguing faces that he met, he also looked at people's teeth. For instance, the priest who was milling about, straightening the cloths on the high altar of St. Etheldreda's Roman Catholic Church, had a serious case of overcrowding. His teeth jumbled together like the pool pile in a game of dominoes. Richard shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Lobo needed to hurry. Even though he was facing the main church exit, Richard knew there was a seldom-used entrance behind him in the sacristy, and it made him nervous to have his back to it. It was true, someone would need to jump a very tall wall to get into the courtyard, but ever since last Wednesday night, Richard wouldn't put anything past anyone any more. The door to the church swung open, flooding the large church briefly with bright daylight. The couple of elderly ladies on a nearby pew turned to see what new Lamb of God and/or sheep of gossip was arriving. Seeing only a man in his late 30s or early 40s, they turned back to their whispered conversation. Lobo sighted Richard and walked with a loping grace up the center aisle, head held high, knowing Richard had already assessed and neutralized any threats that theoretically existed in the church. There had been none. He sat on the left end of a pew, halfway up the aisle, 20 feet or so from Richard. After a minute, Richard finished his unspoken prayer and crossed himself, turning and walking along the side aisle of the church, to the north transept. 2 minutes later, Lobo followed. "I need you to look into some people for me. Here's a list." Richard shoved a small slip of paper into Lobo's hand. "I may not have gotten all the names right." "You've always been shite with names," Lobo murmured. "Yeah, so try variations. Anyway, there's a kingpin. I don't know his real name, but he goes by Voldemort." Lobo's blue eyes flashed up at Richard's hazel ones. "Did you say Voldemort?" "Yes." Lobo looked around, assuring himself once more that they were alone. "I think you need to speak with someone else. Have you ever been in contact with an agent named Wicks?" At this, Lobo looked appraisingly, curiously at Richard, as though they'd never met. That was odd, Richard thought, seeing as they'd worked together on several missions over the years. But Richard was on guard as well. "Yes, we've spoken." "How?" This one word was said with such confusion and disbelief, and it made Richard a bit paranoid. Lobo likely had no reason to speak with Wicks, to even know of her existence. So how did he know of it? Richard had known Lobo for years, ever since Lobo had been assigned to his team as a junior agent. They had served on missions together, and Richard trusted the man's unparalleled instinct and sense of timing without question. And yet He didn't even know the man's real name, or what he did when he wasn't acting as a secret agent in Her Majesty's service. The same was true of Richard's identity to Lobo. Lobo only knew him as Danger Mouse. It wasn't as if they hung out, grabbed beers together at weekends. They worked together on a brief mission as needed, then parted ways until the agency paired them up again. Richard took his time in answering. "I spoke with Wicks a few years ago to confirm the existence of a group of people living in the shadows of society." "And you have retained your memories of this conversation, of these people?" Richard narrowed his eyes at Lobo. The man was asking why he had not been obliviated, which he gathered was the standard procedure if a non-magical person with no relation to the wizarding world encountered magic. "No, I have a family tie to the community." Lobo gasped. He looked quickly to his right to confirm that no one was watching, then reached into the lapel of his coat. Richard, out of instinct rather than mistrust, did the same, his fingers inching towards the butt of the small revolver in his holster. "I'm not drawing a weapon on you," Lobo said quietly. But he did remove a long, thin bit of twig from his pocket. Richard's eyes widened as the man moved the twig, and a feeling like an invisible wet blanket fell over the air. Lobo took Richard by the arm and spun on the spot. As they disappeared, the votive candles flickered in the whirl of suddenly displaced air. Thank you for listening to this chapter of The Muggle Death Eater by Great 78.